Hi all, this is the second video for Module 2, our sort of case study video. In this module, this case study, I'm going to talk a little bit about numbers in the Atlantic slave trade, and I think this hopefully will help lead directly into your module on applying history and the sort of assignment for this module. The work is like slightly differently distributed in this module than in the first module. The first module, you had 2 textbook chapters to write, reflecting that one of our modules is kind of 2 weeks of a normal fall or semester course, summer semester course, fall or spring semester course. This time, instead of 2 textbook chapters, you have 1 textbook chapter and then 1 article about thinking about the slave trade and numbers. That's part of your applied history. So if you look in the grade book, as a result, you'll see the assignment is worth 60% of this module's grade, whereas last module was worth 40% because the work is more focused on the applying history section than on the reading for this time. So today we're going to look at something, or in this video, we're going to look at something called the Atlantic Slave Trade Database, or slave voyages. So I'll give you a little bit of history about this before we get into applying history. So in the first video, the video lecture, I told you a little bit about the scope and scale of the Atlantic slave trade, the continents it involved, and the fact that there were approximately 12.5 million captives forced aboard ships in Africa. But the fact that we have that number is relatively new. For a long time, historians weren't really sure how many people were taken through the Atlantic slave trade. So before the 1960s, really through about 1969, the estimates put together by scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois and others ranged from about 3.5 million all the way up to 100 million people. That's a huge, enormous difference, right? And it was difficult for people to figure out because the slave trade involved centuries of history, at least 4 continents, tens of thousands of voyages, and there was no one archive to go to figure it out. But eventually historians started collaborating. And in 1969, a historian named Philip Curtin here published a census of the Atlantic slave trade. And Curtin said that he thought about 9.6 million people, based on his research, had been forced onto ships in Africa, right? Big change from 3.5 to 100. He's giving a much more precise range, or precise number. People started interrogating his work and kind of finding some ways it could be improved upon. And scholars kind of responded to him, including this man in the bottom left, Joseph Inakori, another history professor. And Professor Inakori offered a 15 million figure, which is a little bit closer to the truth than Curtin's number. And it was only in the 1990s, within many of your lifetimes, that scholars got an answer or an estimate that was rooted in trying to catalog every single voyage, every single captive through the slave trade. And that came through a team that was in some ways led by this historian, David Eltis, but involved many scholars from South America, from Africa, from North America, from Europe and other places. It involved an army of graduate students, as well as professors and researchers across the world. It was a huge task to put together. And they came to an estimate that we more or less use today of 12.5 million people. And the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which is now often called the Slave Voyages Database, you know, it used to look like this. It has a new landing page now that I'll show you in a minute. It used to be called the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. It got sort of rebooted within the past year or so. And it collected all of this information and made it publicly accessible, right? Initially, it was a CD-ROM. Now it's an online database that anybody can access for free. And this database has been used for all sorts of things. Some of you may have seen on popular news and other websites this visualization. It was, this version here is from Slate, which produced it, but it's been located in other places as well. And this data has been used for different things. So what I'm going to show you here is a visualization that shows with dots each documented voyage from Africa to the Americas over time, made possible by this database. And so you see in the 1500s, right, there's very little data. You see like little dots starting to shoot across each of these dots, and we'll see kind of some of the problems with representing ships full of captives as just a dot or a number. But we can start to see from West and Central Africa, ships going across the Atlantic to the Americas. And we start to see 1619, you saw that one dot go to Virginia, right, where Africans were purchased as, depending on the scholars, as a form of indentured servants or as enslaved people. And then we're going to look into the 1660s, 70s, 80s shortly, and we'll start to see those dots going a bit farther south to the Carolinas, starting in kind of the 1680s. You'll see occasional dots going up here to New England. But what you will see is the bulk of these voyages going to Brazil and to the Caribbean. And you can see visually here that North America is not the main focus of this trade at this point. And we're going to start to see, you can see down here, the total scope, right, starts to increase rapidly around now in the mid 1700s. And as you watch this video, right, it starts to become constant from Angola, Congo towards Brazil, and from West Africa here towards the Caribbean. And watch for the date 1776 and start to see things drop off a little bit. And that'll be the influence of the American Revolution, right, around here, right? Things start to slow down a little bit with the disruption of the American Revolution. Then wait for 1791 in the Haitian Revolution. Once again, things start to slow down a little bit for a few years and then pick right back up. And then you'll see the year 1808, when Britain and the United States abolished the Atlantic slave trade, and this northern part especially will almost disappear, right? There are illegal smuggling voyages, but otherwise we have stuff going to the Spanish Caribbean, but it's rare that ships go to colonial North America or to the United States itself after 1808. In 1830, Brazil starts to take some action. And then in 1850, you're going to see Brazil take drastic action against the slave trade here. And it's going to slow down overwhelmingly, and Cuba is the main destination after this point. So that's one way the data from this database has been used. What I'm going to show you for the rest of the time here is just how to navigate the database yourself. It now looks like this, Slave Voyages. It's a link in the Applied History section. And for your assignment, you will look through this database, navigate it, and then you'll answer a question. You're going to get a letter, a real letter from 1787, and you're going to use the database to do some detective work and figure out what this ship was and details about it. And I'm going to show you how to do that now. Then you'll read the excerpt from a man named Olaudah Equiano. And Olaudah Equiano wrote a narrative that is one of the few sort of first-hand descriptions of the Middle Passage or the Atlantic slave trade between Africa and the Americas. And you're going to sort of see the tension between the picture of the Atlantic slave trade we get from just looking at numbers and the picture we get from looking at someone's lived experience. And then you're going to have a reading by a scholar named Jessica Johnson. called Markup Bodies, and it's about the dangers of quantifying the experiences of enslaved people and the dangers we run of like sort of making them abstract and not real. And you're going to see her offer some arguments for ways forward, ways to kind of reclaim some of the approaches to data and slavery. And then in your assignment, you're going to answer 3 questions. 1, you're going to use the database to locate the ship and the letter. 2, you're going to read the Equiano excerpt. It's very short, like 1 page, and say like, okay, how does this give me a different perspective? And then the 3rd question is going to be based on the Johnson article, which will ask you like, what are the problems with data and what is the way forward, right? And so you're going to kind of put everything together there, and it'll help you both understand the Atlantic slave trade better. It'll help you understand sort of, on the other hand, ethical questions, right, that we face as historians when we use numbers and things like that. And so it'll kind of give you sort of some historical thinking and skills, as well as specific knowledge of the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, so I'll very quickly run through what'll happen. You can click on the link in Moodle, right? It'll take you to this website. Otherwise, I think the URL is slavevoyages.org, something like that. But the link's on Moodle. And you'll go here on the landing page to click this arrow by Transatlantic, which will open this up. You'll click on the database itself. And before I move forward, I want to encourage you on your own to kind of look at some of the other aspects of this if you're interested, right? You can see some maps. There's some essays to help you understand it. There's also an African names database, which shows in cases where British and some other places captured illegal slave trading voyages, they would record the names of the captives held aboard that ship by the enslavers. And you can see that there. So there's all sorts of stuff here. If you want to learn a bit more about it, there's an intro video by Henry Louis Gates Jr., who's a leading African-American studies scholar at Harvard University that kind of give you some background. Anyway, you'll click on database. It'll take you here to this maybe sort of overwhelming landing page. And basically how this thing works is all of these tabs here, when you click on them, they'll give you a bunch of fields, right? So if I clicked on here, like itinerary, it would show up here, place of departure, purchase, etc. And then it would give me all of these options, right? If I want to search for all voyages that came from Africa, then I would click here and it would say, okay, here are all the other different regions of Africa. Maybe you want to just search for places from, for example, your letter might mention the Gold Coast. You could say, click, I want to do this. You'd go down and save that category. But then you can search by, and it'll narrow it. But you can add a whole bunch of different other sort of search requirements at one time. Oops. So you could add itinerary, but you could also add the ship, the nation, the owner. You could add the details about enslaved people, dates, captain and crew. And so for the first question, you're going to go through and you're going to look for clues in the letter. Can you find a guess about the range of dates it might be? Can you find the number of enslaved people who might have been held on it? Can you find where enslaved people were purchased, captives were purchased? The one sort of tip I'll give you is don't be too specific. So remember, this is a real historical letter. It's not something I've created for the purposes of our course. So for example, in the letter, the person, Robert Hibbard, writing it, mentions 600 captives. He uses a word that we won't use, and there's a note in the quiz about racial language. He says 600 captives, right? If you go to the enslaved people category and you enter 600, you aren't going to find the right result, because remember, this is a person writing a letter, right? And so he's using estimates and rough numbers. So, for example, if you get a number, I would err like 25 or 5% on either side, right? If you get a date, like when he wrote the letter, right? He writes the letter in 1587. So you know it has to be, what he's describing has to have happened in 1587 or earlier. You know, so there's things like this, right? So try and keep your searches more general. And then once you get down to it, start to narrow your results. And ideally, you'll be able to get down to one. If you put all 4 pieces of information you can find from the letter, you can get down to one. But even if you can only narrow it down to, say, 4 or 5 records like this, you can click on the record and it'll give you more detailed information about the voyage, and you'll be able to kind of sort through it like that, see if it matches up to the letter. And I do encourage you to contact me via Zoom, send me an email or a Moodle message, and we can set up a time to Zoom if you want to talk through any of this or things. And you can, of course, always email me with quick questions. So if you click on one of these voyages, you'll get something like this. You can scroll down for more information, but it'll tell you the vessel name. This is the piece of information you're searching for. Flag means where it's from. Rig, you don't need to worry about. That's like naval stuff. Outcomes, itineraries, etc. When you're doing itinerary, like make sure you read carefully. Are you looking for the place where the voyage began? Are you looking for the place where captives were purchased? What are you looking for? And make sure it matches up to what you're putting in from the letter. Also, just give you a little bit of detail, the markup bodies reading that you'll use in the assignment is written by Jessica Johnson. I encourage you to check out her Twitter if you're interested in this topic, at JMAFRX. She tweets a lot. She's a leading scholar, not just of Atlantic slavery. Her work, actually, much of her work is on Louisiana and the Caribbean, but also of kind of digital history. So she's really like someone who puts a lot of her work out there publicly via Twitter and other things, and really engages with kind of important questions related to this module. You'll also be reading a very short excerpt from what's called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. It's his autobiography, in which he describes, as I said, the middle passage, and you just have a very short excerpt from it, about 1 page. And as you're going through the material, think about a few questions. How do the experiences of captives in the Atlantic slave trade seem different when we look at numbers versus when we looked at lived experiences? What does a quantitative approach do, right? What does the data from this Atlantic slave trade database do? What does it offer us? But also, what does it close off? And then what does an approach grounded in the words and experiences of captives or later enslaved people do? What does that offer us that the numbers can't? And what is the sort of way forward or potential solution that Professor Johnson offers? Dr. Johnson makes an argument for, like, we don't need to just discard numbers and digital approaches, but we have to be critical and we have to think about how to do it. And so what is the way forward that she offers specifically? So that's the end of our short case study video. It should also serve as sort of instructions for your assignment. And like I said, please do reach out to me, email me, set up a time to Zoom, or just to talk via, or we can just exchange emails if you have any questions or anything like that. I'm happy to hear from you. All right, I will next see you, I guess, via video in Module 3.